if we might make a start. It's 6:30. Bună seara, zi bine ai venit. How did I go, Doru?
Not bad.
Oh, good evening and welcome to the new conversation series, Hardwired, Human Consciousness and Christian Faith. We value and are so grateful to all of you for supporting ISCAST and New Zealand Christians in Science. But please let me say this before we begin. As we gather in the presence of God, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet. In his wisdom and love, our Heavenly Father entrusted this estate, from where I'm speaking tonight, to the stewardship of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. As we continue to learn to live together on these ancestral lands, we acknowledge all the traditional custodians from each of the geographic areas we meet from tonight and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And we pray that God will unite us all in the knowledge of his Son, in whom all things were created. Now, most of you will already know that my name is Sarah Wilson. I'm the Program Director for ISCAST. And one of my jobs is to help coordinate the speaker program with Nicola Hogard-Cregan, the co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science. Jackie Liao, who is ISCAST's digital communications expert, designs ISCAST's website, among a myriad of other things. And Grace Cox is New Zealand Christians in Science's administrator, and she also studies theology at university. Together with ISCAST's executive director, Chris Mulheron, we put together and run the conversation series. And I think we can all agree, if you were here last week, that the instalment last week was a really good success and we had a wonderful attendance. Just very briefly, and in case you are new to the conversations, I should say, this is how tonight's evening and most others will run. Our speaker will give a presentation for around 30 minutes, which will then be followed by about 30 minutes of conversation. The evenings do strictly run for just 1 hour, but if our speaker is happy to have a bit of a chat for a few extra minutes, that's okay, but it's not compulsory, Doru. Our conversation tonight will be moderated by Chris Mulheron, who should be on holidays right now, but has come in very graciously tonight to help moderate. If you have a question tonight, I recommend that you put it in the chat as soon as possible to ensure that there is enough time for your question to be raised and answered. When the time comes, Chris will ask you to unmute so that you can ask your question directly to your speaker. And that reminds me, please remember to keep yourselves on mute for the duration of the evening unless requested otherwise. Now, before I introduce our speaker tonight, I invite you to pray with me. Heavenly Father, creator of all things, seen and unseen, understood and beyond our understanding, we thank you for last week's conversation, its attendance, and for the fantastic conversation we had together afterwards. Tonight, keep helping us to understand the mystery of consciousness and guide us in the right direction so we know what consciousness is and where its boundaries lie. Help us to grow, broaden our understanding and have respectful conversations with those who have views that differ from our own. We thank you for Doru, our speaker tonight, for his expertise, his many gifts, his tireless academic and pastoral work, and his deep desire to know you and share his experiences with us all. May Doru's words deepen our understanding of what consciousness is, and may that growth in knowledge positively affect our relationship with others and with you who created this mysterious gift. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Now, our speaker tonight is Doru Kostake. He's a much-loved member of ISCAST staff team, but to put things more formally, he is ISCAST's research director and an associate professor at the Sydney College of Theology. He co-edits Christian Perspectives on Science and Technology, and he is a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion, and of course he's a fellow of ISCAST. He was a Selby Old Fellow in Religious History of the Orthodox Christian Faith at the University of Sydney Library and co-chaired the Cosmology Group project, Science and Orthodoxy Around the World. He is an author, one of his books being Humankind and the Cosmos, Early Christian Representations, and he's co-author of Dreams, Virtue and Divine Knowledge in Early Christian Egypt. In his spare time, Doru has a wife and a grown daughter, and as I was chatting about earlier, he is pursuing his second doctorate. And tonight, he will be speaking on the whole and the person, the destiny of the self in the infinite universe. And I have pleasure in welcoming Doru.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this very kind introduction. And for your prayer. I hope that the Lord will guide everyone, including myself, towards understanding this ineffable thing called consciousness. Actually, this is one of the questions that I won't be asking, and I won't be trying to address, to respond. But anyway, let's roll the ball. It's my duty and respectful honor to acknowledge the Gadigal clan of the Guringai people upon whose ancestral lands I live. I pay respect to their elders, past and present. May we all learn wisdom from the ancient peoples who were and are able to find their way in the world, in the cosmos. Above all, may we all receive grace and light from the risen Christ to rise above our fears and the anxiety of being lost in the cosmos. This is actually my topic, and I assume this is a topic of great interest for many people, including for those of us who don't know why they go through angst in various circumstances of life. It might have to do with the fact that we live in an infinite universe. Who knows? This presentation is based on a little book I have recently written, finished together with an astrophysicist from the University of Sydney, Geraint Lewis. It's provisionally called The Universe and the Self, Cosmologies, Knowns and Unknowns in Scientific and Theological Perspective, but I have added some poetical extras. Now, I think it's very important for us as Homo sapiens, as intelligent beings, to know our way around, to understand where we are at and where we are going. So, can we find our way around things? Of course, for us, people living in these technological societies, such as Australia, if we have maps and GPSs, yes, definitely. But how about in the universe? Can we find our way? Sorry for the misspelling there. Looking at the two images that you see on the slide, there are two photos of a place in Ku-ring-gai National Park nearby, where you can see Aboriginal carvings that mark the land, mark the territory, and make it familiar, habitable. These carvings allow for orientation, and of course we know from other places throughout the land we now call Australia that there are more significant landmarks that point people to places of gathering, where they can find water, where they can find food, where they can find each other. But given the topic of my talk, I thought I should also show two more images that have to do with the universe, with the sky above. This time round, two representations of the galaxy, of the Milky Way. On the lower right corner, you see a modern representation of the rainbow serpent, which is an image of the galaxy, and an ancient, prehistoric representation of the same galaxy as a river in the sky, with a divine being represented there. In both cases, we have this idea that the world is familiar, the world is recognizable, the world is a place where we belong, and they suggest familiarity and, I assume, harmony. Now, those representations might be actually false. They might be misrepresentations. We can call them mythical misrepresentations of reality. But this doesn't mean that we Christians are better off or better equipped to face reality. For example, you see here 4 images. They are organized in chronological fashion. You might recognize the cosmic temple model of the Old Testament. By the way, I have borrowed this image from a recently published article in our journal, Christian Perspectives on Science and Technology, an article by a Canadian author, Alan Deacon. There's the geocentric system of Ptolemy. Of course, this is a representation from the late Middle Ages, early modernity. And then the small square at the bottom, that's a lovely image of a universe in the form of a box. You can see there's a lid, and on the lid there's an image of Christ, I assume. And inside the box there's the mountain, the cosmic mountain. So that's another Christian representation of reality coming from the 6th century, from the famous geographer and traveler from Alexandria, Cosmas Indicopleustes. And there, of course, the fancy image, right-hand corner, very fancy, very digital, but equally erroneous, if not worse than the previous ones, the flat Earth, 21st century, a 21st century Christian myth. So, all these might be misrepresentations of reality, I repeat, but they help us to find our way. At least they give us a hope that we can find our way in the universe. But then, if the universe can be represented in such a familiar fashion, whichever fashion we like, why are modern people so afraid of the vast expanses above our heads? I think the story of this anxiety about the infinite universe has begun much earlier than our time, in the 17th century. I don't think Blaise Pascal was the first person to have experienced this angst, and I actually believe that given his faith, because he was a Christian, he did not fear the universe, but he found this way of expressing the anxiety of his generation, of his compatriots, mainly in France, at the bad news of an infinite universe. And he says in his Pensées, reflections, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. Why was he so scared? Why were people in the 17th century so scared? Wasn't this what you see in the photo there, photo of the sky above my place? Wasn't this what humanity has contemplated for at least 1 million years? You know? But to hear Pascal again, the infinite immensity of spaces I ignore and that ignore me, this is what actually scares people. There's this idea of a universe that is quiet, that is silent, that is meaningless, that has no voice and has nothing to do with our existence. Now, Pascal's might perhaps be the first modern expression of what Walker Percy in the 1980s called the predicament of the self. But what matters here is the fact that his way of articulating the problem resonates very well with us, even in the 21st century. Why is that? It's because when we look at the photo, the familiar galaxy, whatever can be seen from our cities, when we expand this vista, this familiar vista, to the idea of an infinite space, an infinite universe, what sounds and looks familiar actually becomes horrible, terrifying. And let's put things in perspective. Why are we so afraid? Well, this is a recently revealed photo taken in 2010 by the Messenger spacecraft around the orbit of Mercury. And what you see there, the brighter dots, are the Earth and its satellite, our moon. Quite far away, isn't it? And it really puts things in perspective, and we can realize why people might fear the vastness of the cosmos. But I think from the orbit of Mercury, we can still find our way home. Only barely, but we can. But how about this one? This is an image, NASA, of the universe, or a bit of the universe, and all those tiny dots, some of them are brighter than others, are galaxies. And you see all this network of galaxies, very much like the neurons in our brain, but expanded at the infinite, on an infinite scale. And there you have it. Now we can have a real problem. How can we find our way in such a universe, isn't it? Quite difficult. My question, can the traditional wisdom mentioned earlier still help us find our way in the cosmos? Perhaps, if the cosmos is still maintained, geocentric, perhaps figuratively speaking, but it would take some tweaking, perhaps a lot of tweaking. Now, part of the challenge, part of the problem, and I'm quoting from an article by Lisa Sedaris, my concern, she says, with the new cosmology is that its global or cosmic orientation interferes with connecting with what is immediately before you. So it's quite difficult to focus on the immediate when cosmology reveals to you this immensity of the universe. She offers a possible solution, I think indirectly, to this problem in an interview. It's a discussion called Beyond Oneself with other colleagues, where she talks about wonder. And she says wonder is a way of being in the world, a way of orienting ourselves in the world. So although we might be still frightened, exasperated by the vastness of the cosmos, wonder can still help us find our way home. Well, what's the origin of the problem we now face? The problem is that we used to be someone, but now we are almost nothing, nobody. How were things perceived in the past? Humanity was the crown of creation, divinely placed in the very center of a cosmos whose onion-layered structure, remember Ptolemy's system, encloses it protectively, giving it a sense of both importance and familiarity. We were at the center of things. But then, in the Renaissance, started this paradigm shift, slowly cooking, as I call it, with Nicholas of Cusa, who spoke of an infinite universe. That was a logical assertion, but an important one nonetheless. And then with Copernicus, who invented or discovered the fact that the Earth wasn't in the center of things, and he elaborated on the heliocentric system. Our Earth is but a satellite of our star, the Sun. And then Isaac Newton developed physically and mathematically the modern idea of an infinite universe. So we have this trajectory from the familiar cosmos centered on us, which gives us a sense of importance, to a boundless universe, uncentered, without, let's call them geodesics, like in mathematics, arrows to point us the way, without hierarchies and values. And of course, this led to our identity, an identity crisis. Who are we? Do we matter? Does anything matter? Now, what we now are isn't so great, isn't it? Pascal's reference to an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere leaves the self bereft of geodesics in the chaos of existence. But does it? We seem to have gotten this one the wrong way. Bear with me, I'll return to this matter. But anyway, this is the topic for the time being, and this is the perception that since the center is everywhere, or nowhere rather, we have a problem because we no longer belong, or we no longer matter. An Orthodox theologian last century, one of the great ones, Vladimir Lossky, mentioned an off-centered universe, which renders the quantitative vastness of reality a meaningless desert, pointless, where the self, despite Descartes' vindication of the cogitating ego, doesn't find reasons not to feel insignificant. And then, of course, closer to our time, we have one of the giants of modern physics, Steven Weinberg, saying at the end of his famous book, The First 3 Minutes, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. The effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy, a pointless existence. And I would say to know about things isn't the same as to know things, ourselves included. Therefore, regardless of how much Weinberg would praise the advancements of science, of our knowledge, still these advancements can't help. So, no wonder authors that I love, Kurt Vonnegut and Walker Percy, both mentioned, ironically, sarcastically, the fact that modern existence amounts to empty heroics, low comedy, and a pointless death, and a comic mystery of existence. And there's no help in whatever we have replaced the old paradigm by. No wonder Percy's disappointment with, I quote, the debilitating strictures of modern psychology. I know some psychologists here will scream, will shout out loud, which has not the means of saying anything at all about the self, let alone spirit. Indeed, he continues, we don't seem to know much more about the psyche than Plato did. So we know so much about the outer world, about the universe, but we know so little about ourselves, and therefore we cannot overcome the anxiety that we experience, the crisis that we are facing. So what are we going to do about it? To paraphrase Walker Percy, we need a new Copernican turn. Percy says, like Copernicus and Einstein, turn the universe. It's an exhortation. Turn the universe upside down and begin with a new assumption. What kind of assumption? How do we get there? What kind of assumption? Our dear Tom McLeish used to say in his Faith and Wisdom in Science, it all begins by asking daring and different questions. What kind of questions? A new Copernican turn, which would mean, in Percy's words, to move from the other-directed to being inner-directed. So a different kind of orientation in life where we pay less attention to the universe out there, and we pay more attention to ourselves, to the self that feels bereft of significance in this world. I would be more balanced than this. I wouldn't want to lose sight of either the earthly environment or the universe at large. And therefore, I have to return to Lisa Sederis's point about wonder as a way of being in the world, a way of orienting ourselves in the world. And wonder seems to be the best interface for us mortal people when it comes to bridging the inner world of the self and the outer world. We need, however, an Archimedean point of support to be able to mount this Copernican turn, this new revolution. Do we have to reinvent the wheel to that end? Now, I turn to Teilhard de Chardin, an author that I dearly love, but not before going through a bit of history. The ancients already thought of consolidating the self against getting lost in the cosmos. This is something that not many people realize. For example, we all remember Socrates' exhortation, know yourself, what he found on the frontispiece of the temple in Delphi. Know yourself. Why is that? On the other hand, you have Plato's cosmology, at least in Timaeus, cosmology and the self. I think the ancients tried to assert the two domains, to affirm the importance of both domains, the outer world and the inner or inside world. And there you have it. We have fully fledged developments already in classical antiquity. The same with Aristotle's natural world, outer world. Aristotle wasn't so much into psychology, if memory serves, although he has a treatise on the soul. But then you have Plotinus's revolution, the Neoplatonic revolution, which is very much one that moves introspectively, moves within, and the whole emphasis of Plotinus's philosophy seems to be, from my viewpoint, this affirmation of the self despite the immensity of the world as the ancients represented it. The early Christians themselves weren't insensitive to this kind of double discourse about the inner and the outer worlds. For example, we hear Jesus is saying in the Gospel of Matthew, and I have there two passages. What will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Where you have on the one hand the universe, you can become master of the universe, but that won't serve you at all, won't serve yourself if yourself is lost in the process of gaining the universe. And then look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? So the conclusion harks back to the previous passage where the self is more important than the universe, but still the Father feeds everything, feeds the universe, as a matter of fact. And we know from other parts of Scripture, from the Psalms, that God gives food to everything, including the mountains and lions and deer and rabbits. Now, in St. Paul, we have the famous and beautiful hymn in Colossians 1, 15, 20, where we see Christ healing and unifying humankind and the cosmic regions. A world that is both of human beings, for human beings, accommodating us, but a world that goes way beyond what we conceive as our immediate environment. And we have a cosmic vision indeed in Colossians 1. A cosmic vision, but that doesn't lose us in the process. We are there too. And then in the 4th century, just one other example, Athanasius of Alexandria speaks of the importance of knowing God, the self, and the world. So 3 objects, not just one. Knowing God, the self, and the world, through exploring the self and the cosmos. So these are early Christian attempts at bridging the world's inner and outer worlds. And I think that it is on this backdrop that we should continue our journey. And on this note, I move to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Why Teilhard de Chardin? Well, I believe that regardless of how much he was misinterpreted, accused of this and that, and finally forgotten, Teilhard de Chardin is a crucial thinker of the end of the 20th century, well, second half of the 20th century, and even influential, I think very much so in terms of the topic of panpsychism addressed by Joanna last week. Even though panpsychists like Thomas Nagel, for example, simply ignore Teilhard de Chardin, and even Joanna, if I may, mentions in her published dissertation Teilhard de Chardin like 4 or 5 times, well, occasionally, so to speak, tangentially. And I believe that Teilhard de Chardin deserves much more attention on our part. First of all, not because of panpsychism, but because Teilhard de Chardin developed a Christian view of reality. A Christian view of reality, but articulated with the means, the tools, the intellectual tools of a theologian, a philosopher, and a scientist. So, is there more to it, more than what we have learned so far? Could Christian thinkers further explore the interface of the two worlds, inner and outer? Here's what Teilhard de Chardin says in his Le Phénomène humain, the human phenomenon. And all these passages are my translation, so if you find something that doesn't sound so kosher, please forgive the translator. So, Teilhard says, I have tried to show that no progress can be expected on earth without the primacy and triumph of the personal at the summit of the spirit. He believes in evolution, an evolution that begins at the bottom of reality, where he finds a tendency, a potential for consciousness, even spirit. Now, at the present time, he says, on the entire surface of the noosphere, the sphere of, let's say, intelligence, consciousness, Christianity represents the only current of thought bold enough and progressive enough to embrace the world practically and effectively in a complete gesture, though an indefinitely perfectible one, where faith and hope reach fulfillment in charity. It is it, Christianity, and only it, that on the modern earth shows itself capable of synthesizing in a single vital act the whole and the person. And this is the title of my presentation and my topic: how to bridge the whole and the person, the self and the universe. He does that in a number of ways, and I have identified 2 steps. I don't know if this is how he would have presented his own approach, but that's how I systematize his approach. Step 1, consciousness is the inside of nature's outside. In his words, we have come to recognize within the fabric of the universe the existence of an internal conscious face that necessarily doubles everywhere, the external material face, the only one usually considered by science. So the first assumption or prerequisite of his system is that consciousness is everywhere. On various levels of actualization, let's use this Aristotelian term, but it's there. This interface of psychism and thought is the most significant aspect of the fabric of the universe. That's what he says. And then human consciousness is the awake, self-aware summit of this universal potential for consciousness. In his words, the human being finds and considers itself, contemplates itself in everything that it sees. So there's this familiarity between the universe and the self, in that the self finds a promise of itself everywhere in nature. So the universe begins to look more welcoming to us, isn't it, than Pascal's quiet vastness. The second step, according to Teilhard, or at least how I represent Teilhard, is deeply Christian. The source, the mode of evolution, and the fulfillment of the process of psychic awakening is Christ. In his words, as principle of universal vitality, Christ, by arising as a human being among human beings, has placed himself in the position and has always been in the process of including within himself, of purifying, guiding, and superanimating the general rise of consciousness in which he has inserted himself through the incarnation. By a perennial action of communion and sublimation, he is aggregating the total psychism of the earth. So all this evolution towards consciousness that Teilhard observes everywhere in nature is centered upon Christ. Christ is the engine of the whole process, and it finds fulfillment in the mystery of Christ. Perhaps this sounds unusual, isn't it? But this is just another way of reciting Colossians 1:15-20, much the way C.S. Lewis's great dance does. And I move on to give you a few passages from another great author I love so dearly, C.S. Lewis, who in a novel, Perelandra, gives towards the end this beautiful hymn of, let's call it, creation. It's like a Christian rendition, from my viewpoint, of what Teilhard says in a more philosophical, scientific way. I'm just reading from the Great Dance. He, that is Christ, or Maleldil, the king of angels, he dwells, all of him dwells within the seed of the smallest flower and is not cramped. Deep heaven is inside him, who is inside the seed and does not distend him. Blessed be he. Though men and angels rule them, the worlds are for themselves. So, no anthropocentrism there. Their own voice was in them, not merely a dreaming of the day when you should awake. So remember Teilhard's psychism. They also were at the center. The center is everywhere. Already Pascal said that. Be comforted, small immortals. You are not the voice that all things utter, nor is there eternal silence in the places where you cannot come. Blessed be he. So there are voices everywhere. The universe is meaningful. There's no actual silence for someone who has ears to hear. And the great dance continues. The dust, that dust itself, which is scattered so rare in heaven, whereof all worlds and the bodies that are not worlds are made, is at the center. It waits not till created eyes have seen it, or hands handle it, to be in itself a strength and splendor of Maleldil, Christ, who utters in each grain of it the unmixed image of his energy. Each grain, if it spoke, would say, I am at the center, for me all things were made. Let no mouth open to gainsay it. Blessed be he. So again, no anthropocentrism, but still a world that has voices, many voices. Where Maleldil is, there is the center. He is in every place, not some of him in one place and some in another, but in each place the whole Maleldil, even in the smallness beyond thought. Each thing was made for him. He is the center. Because we are with him, each of us is at the center. In his city, all things are made for each. Each thing, from the single grain of dust to the strongest eldil, is the end and the final cause of all creation, and the mirror in which the beam of his brightness comes to rest and so returns to him. Blessed be him. So, a world that is full of thought, a world that has voice. There are many voices in creation, and all these voices sing grace. All these voices tell the Creator and Provident Maleldil and Savior Maleldil how grateful they are. So C.S. Lewis's Great Dance and Teilhard's Christ-centered evolutionary psychism converge, I believe, in depicting a meaningful universe where the self can find geodesics, orientation, everywhere. And I move to my conclusion. The modern predicament of the self consists in realizing the self's quantitative insignificance, a trap that traditional wisdom can easily circumvent. And it comes from the scientific revelation of an infinite universe. Do we need to replace the infinite universe by the temple-shaped cosmos of the Old Testament, the Ptolemaic system, cosmos, box-shaped cosmos, or the flat earth in order to feel significant? Aren't we significant as much as everything else in a universe whose center is everywhere because Christ is everywhere in the infrastructure of all things? Is it not important that our voices are part of a universe-sized chorus? Couldn't we reconstruct the self-esteem from this realization, regardless of what reductionist scientists tell us about reality? We might feel lost in space sometimes, in the infinite universe, but knowing the above provides us with an Archimedean point of support upon which we can rebuild our worldview in a meaningful way. And as far-fetched as Teilhard's ideas might look, at least from the viewpoint of stubbornly reductionist scientists, it is other scientists like Paul Davies, Roger Penrose, and Henry Stapp who now tell us that the ultimate threads of the universe's fabric are made of thought, not dirt. Reality is deep and rich. No such things in it as base matter and pointless life. In this light, the world becomes again meaningful and wonderful, something worthy of wonder. So does too our existence, whether we are Christian or otherwise. Either way, equipped with insights such as Teilhard's and C.S. Lewis's, Christians can confidently step into the arena of contemporary scientific culture and bring good news to the estranged self, lost in the cosmos, lost in confusion.
Well, thank you, Doru. I take it that is your conclusion.
Mine.
Thank you for that stimulating, provocative conversation, urging us to think about our place in the universe. Now, as people know, we're going to use the chat to raise questions for Doru. I will try and follow what's going on in the chat, and generally, unless there are a lot of questions, generally we'll invite the person who's raised a question to actually ask their question so that we meet them. So why don't we meet Claire Harvey, who, for those of you who don't know, is also a part-time staff member of ISCAST. Claire, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. So my question was, I'm hearing in a few different circles, but particularly, I guess, people passionate about creation care and integral ecology and the connection of all things, but also how we cope and survive and look after our mental health. There's this suggestion that we should pursue biophilia, this love of life and living things, I think as a response to this cosmic loneliness and it all being too big and too much to get our literal heads around. But also that might help us try to ward off catastrophe in terms of human civilization and what we're looking at if we don't respond to challenges like biodiversity loss and climate change. So just wondering if that relates and how in your mind it might.
Well, it does, Claire. Thank you very much. And I believe that if we have to learn something, if we are able to learn anything from the last, let's say, 3 centuries or so, from the beginning of the industrial era, is that we cannot focus on one thing merely. And this is why I said at some point, okay, so let's do another Copernican turn and think in terms of the self and the immediate environment. Great, fine. But let's not forget that we are still belonging to this great thing, the universe, which might one day become our home. I do hope that it will, but this doesn't mean that we should lose sight of this immediate home of ours, where we grew up, where we were born and we grew up, you know. So, yes, I think the trends you mentioned earlier are part and parcel of this strategy of overcoming the anxiety that the early modern people experienced at the bad news of an infinite universe that didn't have any value, you know. And actually, this I couldn't get into all these ramifications, but this bad news actually made possible the merciless industrial exploitation of nature. Well, if it doesn't have any meaning, if it's pointless, why on earth should we respect habitats and lives and so on and so forth?
Thank you, Claire. I wonder if Antonius would unmute himself and ask his question about relativity and the centre of the cosmos.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doro. I really enjoyed that. In my very limited understanding of the theory of relativity, Einstein's thing, there is no privileged frame of reference. So basically that means that there is no center to the universe. Wherever you are in the universe, it looks like you're at the center. I'm just wondering if sort of that just seems a very objective scientific idea, and what you're speaking about is more of a spiritual, theological idea. I wonder if you see any connections between them. And just as a small add-on question, does this mean that teenagers are right when they think they're the center of the universe?
We navigate, thank you, Antonius. We navigate between the two extremes, zigzagging between anthropocentrism, egocentrism, and cosmocentrism, yeah, of course, I got the joke. I hope it was a joke about teenagers and that. I think these stances aren't irreconcilable. What I actually believe is that an infinite universe isn't necessarily without relief, without detail. Since you mentioned relativity, there are many centers, gravitational centers, So in a way, where there's a mass, where there's an object with sufficient mass, gravity distorts the environment and makes things turn, let's call it so, in a certain way. But of course, relativity doesn't necessarily mean the universe is infinite. The more philosophical idea of an infinite universe, because it still is philosophical, isn't it? We have no way of proving that it's infinite, mathematically, physically, and otherwise. Yeah, it's an idea. The idea of the infinite universe has to do with a certain perception of reality, which is our perception of reality. And I'm afraid that what happened in early modernity, the bad news of an infinite universe took us by surprise. We were not ready for something that challenged anthropocentrism, that challenged our comfy idea that we were the center of everything, spoiled by God, regardless of how sinful and fallen we might have been, and that we deserved, we were entitled to get everything. And all of a sudden, that world disappeared when scientists and philosophers of science started, later, of course, 18th, 19th century, started to tell people that in reality, an infinite universe doesn't have anything to do with you, people, with your desires, with your expectations. So this is where I believe the physical and the spiritual or psychological somehow need to intersect, and we should look for those tools, intellectual tools, let's call them so, that might help us cope with the idea of an infinite universe.
Thanks, Antonius. Peter Thomas coming to us from Perth. Let me introduce Peter Thomas to everybody. Peter is a volunteer working with ISCAST over in Perth and stirring the pot over there, and we hope generating some conversations over in the west of Australia. Peter, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Doro, for very kind of eye-opening talk to me. I'm not sure I understood it all, but then it's great to have my eyes open to all worlds of thought that I haven't encountered until now. I just picked up something on your last slide about some well-known physicists sort of recognizing threads of thought. Did I get that right? Threads of thought running through the universe?
Thanks, Peter.
I don't understand.
Yeah, it's not threads of thought. They believe that fundamentally the universe is thought. So beneath the material layer or the energetic layer, subatomic, and so on and so forth. The world is made of thought. The names I mentioned there are quite respectable scientists. Paul Davies, Roger Penrose, Sir Roger Penrose. Henry Stapp, perhaps less known, but still very influential. And they speak of layers of reality, and apparently for these people, the ultimate layer of the universe is actually what we could call thought, or something like a potential consciousness. And this is why I believe we should read again Teilhard de Chardin with the eyes of or being equipped by these more recent thinkers and scientists, and perhaps we can do more justice to Teilhard de Chardin. At least that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. At the risk of being facetious, could all that thought running through the universe explain the missing mass? The dark matter?
The dark matter, dark energy, yeah, well, they call them dark, yeah, very good point. They call them dark because they have no idea what they are, and that's like 95% of the universe.
It's mysterious, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, I do have to ask if Ken Freeman is still online. He is, I think. Ken Freeman is with us tonight. He won the Prime Minister's Prize for Science for a paper in the early 70s, very roughly proposing the idea that the universe was made up largely of dark matter. So we have one of the world experts on dark matter and dark energy with us tonight, although he is muted and his video's off, so he might be having tea at the moment. But if he had a comment to make, we'd love to hear from him. But I think he might be. In fact, I think he just went offline.
I'm actually here, Chris. I have a horrible feeling you're going to put the bite on me for this.
Well, look, Ken, you know that I couldn't resist it. So, do you have any comments on what you've heard, and also enlighten us, if you care to, about what we know about dark matter and dark energy?
No, Dora. Well, first, thank you very much, Dora, for a very interesting and exciting talk. No, Dora's absolutely right. We really don't know what dark matter is at all. It could be anything from the tiniest subatomic particles to quite large objects like fairly massive black holes. So we really don't know. And I was involved in the early days of galactic dark matter anyway, and it was we didn't know much at that time. And I think as the years go by, we know less and less. It's not a very satisfactory thing. But just on the general concepts of sort of thought in the universe, this is totally outside anything I know about. I've been living with the concept of a vast universe for the past 55 years, and I can't really comment on aspects of the universe other than the sort of physical universe, which we think we partly understand. But the thing I always come back to in this sort of situation is that remember that the Creator came to visit us in the incarnation, and while we may be insignificant, we're not that insignificant.
Thank you, Ken. It's well, I guess it's really a privilege to have you with us tonight. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. The next question is from Charles. Charles Riding, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, Chris, and thanks, Doru. As you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me is that for Christians, facing an infinite universe, remember, for us, the universe is personal, particularly as previous speaker mentioned that infinite God became finite and lived here for a while. Does that give help, hope, or something like that?
Thanks, Charles. Well, this is something that actually is less problematic for us Christians, believing in the incarnation of God's Son. And if we also remember that God's Son is also the logos of creation, or the word through whom all things were made, then we realize that we live in a very familiar universe whose creator is actually one who has become our brother, Lord and brother to us. And therefore, the problem isn't so much for us in terms of, let's call it, the faith standpoint. But I believe that even Christians have experienced in the early modern days, and perhaps some to this day, the same kind of anxiety because they do not know how to articulate, to bridge their own faith and the evidence that science puts forward of an infinite universe, especially when certain scientists, including Weinberg I mentioned earlier, say something like, well, there you have it, it's the reverse of the gospel, in other words, bad news. Your life is pointless. The only thing that you can do is to do your best to know this universe that is so strange to you, so unfamiliar to you, and still knowledge might give you a sense of, of worth. And since not many of us are scientists, I'm not a scientist, I can't do even that. So what's left for me to do? And I think this kind of reasoning was the origin of this anxiety of many people from the beginning of the modern era. And the book I mentioned, Lost in the Cosmos by Walker Percy, gives a perfect articulation of this anxiety. He actually points out there the fact that, and he was a Christian thinker, and he points out in this book the fact that, there are ways in which we could pretend to forget about the infinite universe and the idea of a pointless existence by doing science or becoming artists and stuff like that. But how many of us can do that? That was his own question. And therefore, we should look for ways of articulating, in our case, Christian faith and this reality of an infinite universe in better ways than we actually do. And I think the two authors I mentioned at the end of my talk, Teilhard de Chardin and C.S. Lewis, give us important pointers for how to approach the topic.
Thanks, Corey. And we'll give the last question, or perhaps it's a comment, to Matt McTeague. Matt, are you there?
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and you have about 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I think, Dory, you actually kind of answered the kind of thrust of my question in the question before me. So I'll just read out what I wrote in the comments. My question was, does it actually really matter if the universe is infinite or not with respect to the special place of the human as Christian theology envisions? Because I believe I come from the classical Orthodox and the Catholic perspective as well. And what features quite prominently in the classical perspective is this idea of the great chain of being. And from what I understand, humans are special, not because of the size of the universe or where we're physically positioned, but because we have both a material and immaterial aspect to our existence, i.e. the body of a beast, but the mind of an angel. So isn't human specialness determined by where we are in the great chain of being and not the size of the universe? So that's my question,
Well, thank you, Matt. That's pretty much what I try to say, or at least through the words of C.S. Lewis, especially C.S. Lewis, that all things matter where they are, and the center is everywhere. And therefore, if we put ourselves in the right frame of mind, and as Christians, there's no reason for us not to do so. We can realize that regardless of where we are located in the universe, regardless of the form, shape, length, width of the universe, we actually matter. But the problem is, and I think this is the philosophical thrust of the entire crisis or predicament of the self in the modern age, is that when the idea of an infinite universe was promoted more and more intensively, more and more aggressively, it came together in one package, so to speak, with the idea of pointlessness. This is what actually causes issues to us, to our consciousness. It's not, as you rightly put it, it's not the infinite universe, it's how it's packaged. And it was packaged as pointlessness. Infinite universe, no center, no values, no significance, life is pointless, therefore let's kill ourselves. That's the idea. That was the equation.
Thank you, Doru. Thank you, Matt. And thank you to everybody for joining us this evening on our second ISCAST New Zealand Christians in Science conversation for this semester. Next week, we have something with a difference. I will be presenting or leading us in a conversation about something that I don't know very much about either, but I will try and introduce us to concepts like the hard problem of consciousness, what it is like to be a bat, and zombies. It's definitely not a highbrow theological or philosophical conversation, but we will be looking at thought experiments that philosophers have used to try and probe the nature of human consciousness and the limits of human consciousness. So perhaps it's something to bring your non-highbrow theological or philosophical friends along to. And then following that more lightweight week, we'll get into some more serious stuff for the next 6 or 7 conversations. Well, let me close by saying thank you to everybody and inviting Grace. If you're there, Grace, please do lead us in a prayer to close our meeting tonight.
Creator God, we thank you for the many mysteries and wonders in our cosmos, and for our minds which marvel and seek understanding. We thank you for the opportunity to gather tonight for Doru and his research, and we call to mind those of us who are not able to be with us. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te tātou ariki o ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu. Ake, ake, ake. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Grace, and good night, everybody. If Doru's happy to stay on, we will allow the conversation to continue a little bit. Certainly Antonius has got another comment about circles, infinite universes and finite universes. He might like to kick off with a few minutes of informal conversation.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, just I noticed that there was a lot of talk about an infinite universe. But my understanding is the universe is not infinite. It's unbounded, so like you never reach the end of it, but it's finite, much like a circle, right? So you never find, if you're going around the circumference of a circle, you never come to an edge or an end of the circle, but you wouldn't say the circle is infinite because it's only like finite. And I think like the universe is the same thing in 4 dimensions rather than 3 dimensions or something. I'm not an expert on this at all, but does that make sense at all?
Yeah, well, this was an idea that I first encountered in Stephen Hawking's book in the 80s, from the Big Bang to the black holes, whatever, short history of time. I think that was one of the first iterations of the idea, at least from him, and he pointed this out, but as a way of denying the usefulness of Big Bang. So if the universe is unbound, like a ball, like a balloon, You can't pinpoint the beginning and the end of the balloon, but yeah, so that's unbound, but it's still a limited, a finite object. Well, I think it's an intellectual construct, as intellectual as the philosophical idea of an infinite universe. So I don't know if it has any relevance to the problem that I try to address of how we feel about it. Yeah, if the universe is limited, finite, or infinite, and so on and so forth, the problem is the same. How the scientists who support the majority view in cosmology, for example, sell the idea. And if they keep selling it in reductionist fashion as, well, I don't see any point, I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and therefore your life is as pointless as mine as a scientist, then there you have it. The problem remains, and we still are challenged to find a way of articulating our position in the cosmos where we can withstand whatever model of the universe is presented.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just say something else very quickly? I take your point. I think there's very little difference between I am nothing compared to an infinite universe and I am nothing compared to a huge universe. So yeah, from what you're talking about, there's not much difference. But there is that important difference that I think only the creator is genuinely infinite or somehow beyond infinity, whereas what he creates is still finite.
Well, that's a...
So, one compared to infinity is nothing, but one compared to, a trillion is still something, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, this is again a logical philosophical topic which was discussed already by Nicholas of Cusa, in the Renaissance, and he postulated two infinities of a different sort. The infinite universe and God's infinity. But that's a logical paradox, I think. I don't know how successful it has been, but I, for one, don't see any relevance to it, because the so-called attribute of divine infinity is simply another human construct. God can be better, I think, can be better expressed in terms of a mathematical singularity or physical singularity, not infinity. A singularity is a point of absolute density that has no color, no whatever dimensions, no weight. You can't say anything about it other than pinpointing its existence. As we know, even eternity, divine eternity, isn't something that we should consider, again, temporally, past, present, future. Endless past, endless future. That's not it. Eternity means now. God is now. This is why God's life is so fresh and happy and exuberant, whereas ours, we are so obsessed with the passage of time. We are always cranky. At least I am, and and I think that's another human construct that has no relevance to God. God as singularity is not infinite, and therefore the topic of an infinite God that might exclude an infinite universe is again another logical paradox that might have nothing to do with reality.
I am no longer moderating. This is an informal discussion now, so if people care to informally discuss, they're welcome to.
May I say something? Nancy here.
Hey, Nancy.
Hi. I just put the comment in, sort of even spelt it wrong. I meant comportment. I really appreciate the focus on wonder. And I think that, like, when you think about sort of science is sort of driven, and even in early childhood education, the idea is bringing children into curiosity. But I think if you look at the two constructs of time and space, which is how our minds, kind of function, and look at curiosity as bounded in time and space, so you're looking at the here and now. But then if we take, and I like this, what you said about wonder, it's so important. If we have this comportment, this, or to use an astronomical term, attitude, as in the attitude of the star, the attitude of wonder, then that actually opens up unbounds, and we can sort of move in between these. I like this idea of the levels of reality and consciousness, the different consciousness, like we looked at last week, which Nicolescu talks about, these levels of consciousness. With wonder, we can sort of move unbounded by time and space, because we're dealing with, in terms of space, infinity, in terms of time, eternality. So it's a much better comportment. And I think it's one that allows for, but we tend to sort of push ourselves into more curiosity. At least it seems to be the phrase that comes up. So wonder is really the space we should be working within in this attitude, I think. Just a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that discussion I mentioned earlier, and Lisa Sideris was part of it, beyond oneself, is actually quite interesting, and it touches on this topic, the difference between curiosity and wonder. Curiosity can be inquisitive, intrusive, can be, I don't know, too bold and imprudent, and so on and so forth. Sometimes, resented by the object of curiosity, while wonder is a very different type of contact with reality. And it crosses realms and layers of reality, or levels of reality, since you mentioned Basarab Nicolescu's transdisciplinarity. I think this isn't just an illusion or a delusion of us mere mortals, that we can be in touch with the universe and reality and make sense of things. Wonder is a way of being in the world, of participating, of realizing how significant we are, but also how significant everything else is. And I believe that one of the things that I could have strengthened in my talk is the topic of anthropocentrism, because we navigate between these extremes of anthropocentrism and cosmocentrism or biocentrism and so on and so forth, and we tend to be very reductionist in whatever we want to do and say. So wonder would be the bridge between many worlds.
I was going to say, it's Philip Pattermore here from Christchurch in New Zealand. I just put a comment there that I was struck by that comment about consciousness being the inside of reality. It's a very interesting thought, and made me think nothing we know about the universe, obviously, is present to us except in our consciousness. And bring back to the previous thought that you had about other things being important, I was thinking of an old set of limericks. I can't remember where they came from. I think a philosophical or a theological journal. It was Reflection on Bishop Berkeley. And the first one said, there was a young man who said, God must find it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree should cease to be when there's no one about in the quad. And the reply came, Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, which is why this tree will continue to be, as observed by yours faithfully, God. And God is present to the universe, and the consciousness of God, in a sense. I just kind of like that idea that consciousness is the inside of, and we're observing the outside through the means of consciousness, and God is present too.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Philip. This is such a beautiful approach. Yeah. Idealism. Anyway, the idea, of course, requires a lot of definition and taking precautions and all sorts of caveats and stuff like that. Consciousness isn't one thing. Reality isn't one thing. There are layers and layers and layers. And even in our Christian tradition, the most basic division of reality, to use this Platonic term, is between the uncreated and the created. So there two different sides of reality, but they are so different that, for example, an anonymous author from the end of the 5th century, usually known as Dionysius the Areopagite, of course this is a pseudonym, said something along these lines. If I'm on this side of the divide, a created being, and this being is indeed being, it exists, then God doesn't exist. And if I'm on the other side, ontologically speaking, so in terms of being, and I look at this side from the uncreated viewpoint, this side doesn't exist. They are so incommensurable, so impossible to compare, that one is nothing to the other. So this is the most basic division of reality, the ontological divide between created and uncreated, but there are various shades of gray, at least within our own reality, the created reality. And there are many models, even the ancients, remember the model of Heraclitus. Heraclitus believed that the heart of reality is what you can call reason or thought, the logos. And then comes energy, and then comes matter and movement. So that's already a layered universe which cannot be reduced to any of its ingredients or layers. We have advanced past that point, and if we ignore materialist reductionism, we have to realize that there's something about that classical intuition of Heraclitus. And by the way, people like Werner Heisenberg, one of the fathers of quantum physics, then closer to us, Michio Kaku, both refer to Heraclitus's intuition about reality as layered and founded on thought or reason, as perfectly compatible with our modern idea of the universe. So I haven't mentioned their names. Why? Because Heisenberg is a bit out of date now, and Michio Kaku is more of a TV star than a scientist. But I mentioned very legitimate scientists like Penrose and Henry Stapp, who say something along the same lines, that fundamentally conscious is everywhere. And Teilhard de Chardin, without having the benefit of our current equipment, was able to say something along the same lines. That's amazing to me.
The consciousness is part of the fabric of the universe as much as anything else.
And at least according to Teilhard de Chardin, there's something like a potential for consciousness in all things. I don't know how this works, but if we listen to people like Roger Penrose, who say something very similar, then something should be there, I think.
Shall we wind up?
I'm very grateful for your attention and questions, comments. I'm really grateful and moved. Thank you.
And we're very grateful to you, Doru, for the fantastic presentation and for being gracious enough to spend an extra hour.
Thank you, Doru. Wonderful
time.
Talk.
Yep. Yeah, it was great.
All the best, everyone, then.
Okay.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right. You have a good night.
Everyone.
Speak soon.
Recording